tonight, when you tuck your children into bed, you might reach for that familiar book of fairy tales. You'll flip to the story of Rapunzel, the beautiful girl with impossibly long hair, trapped in a tower, waiting for her prince to climb up and rescue her. It's romantic, it's magical, and it's completely sanitized. Because what you're reading isn't the real story of Rapunzel. It's a carefully cleaned up version of one of history's most disturbing documented cases of human trafficking, forced imprisonment, and systematic abuse. Every parent who has ever read this story has unknowingly shared the sanitized account of crimes so brutal that medieval communities turned them into cautionary tales. The tower wasn't magical, it was a prison. The long hair wasn't beautiful, it was evidence of prolonged captivity. And the witch? She was a real person whose crimes were so heinous that entire communities created stories to ensure their daughters would recognize the warning signs. The fairy tale we know today began as oral warnings passed down through medieval European communities, warnings about what happened to young girls who vanished from their homes, only to reappear years later as broken shells of their former selves. Behind the romantic imagery of princes and magical towers lies documented evidence of systematic human trafficking operations that destroyed hundreds of lives across medieval Europe. You're about to learn the documented historical events that inspired the Brothers Grimm to collect this particular tale. You'll discover the real medieval practice of tower imprisonment used to break the spirits of kidnapped women. You'll find out why long hair became a symbol of captivity rather than beauty, and how the original Rapunzel story served as a survival guide for medieval parents trying to protect their daughters from predators who operated with impunity. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, across the Germanic regions where the Grimm brothers collected their tales, young women disappeared regularly from rural communities. Court records, church documents, and town chronicles from this period contain hundreds of accounts of girls who were taken from their families and held in remote locations for years. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how systematic they were, and how powerless families were to get their daughters back. The legal system offered little protection for young women from poor families. Wealthy criminals could operate trafficking networks for decades without facing serious consequences. When victims were occasionally rescued, they often found themselves permanently damaged, psychologically broken, physically altered, and unable to return to normal life. The communities that survived these predators created stories to warn future generations about the tactics used by traffickers and the real costs of falling into their traps. The story you think you know is about magic and romance. The story you're about to hear is about documented crime, psychological torture, and the medieval justice system's complete failure to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting charming folk tales. They were preserving evidence of some of the darkest chapters in European history, disguised as children's stories to make them palatable for future generations. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Brothers Grimm felt compelled to preserve this particular warning disguised as a children's story. You'll see how every magical element in the fairy tale corresponds to a documented crime technique. And you'll never be able to read Rapunzel to your children again without remembering the real women whose suffering inspired this tale. The tower is real. The captivity is documented. The trafficking network existed. And the warning remains as relevant today as it was 500 years ago. In 1580, German court records documented the discovery that would expose one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated human trafficking operations. A young woman named Barbara Uthman, was found after 7 years of captivity in a tower belonging to wealthy merchant Friedrich von Zimmern. Her rescue would reveal a network of systematic kidnapping that had operated across the Holy Roman Empire for decades, targeting young women from poor rural families who could disappear without investigation. Barbara's discovery happened almost by accident. Local authorities were investigating reports of strange sounds coming from von Zimmern's supposedly empty tower estate near Regensburg. Neighbours had reported hearing singing and crying coming from the structure for years, but von Zimmern had always claimed the tower was uninhabitable and used only for storage. When a particularly severe storm damaged the tower's roof in late 1580, the sounds became loud enough that authorities could no longer ignore the complaints. When they broke down the tower door, they discovered a 23-year-old woman whose hair had grown to nearly 6 feet in length, whose fingernails were several inches long, and who initially couldn't speak coherently after years of isolation. Court physicians documented her condition in detail, noting signs of prolonged malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, and what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. The medical records describe a woman who had been systematically broken through isolation and dependency. Barbara's physical condition told the story of her captivity. Her skin was pale from lack of sunlight, her muscles had atrophied from confined living conditions, and her hair showed clear evidence of being deliberately maintained and groomed despite her isolation. Most telling were the rope marks around her ankles and wrists, suggesting she had been physically restrained during at least part of her imprisonment. The court physician noted that her hair had been braided with heavy cords, making movement difficult and escape nearly impossible. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated operation targeting girls between 14 and 18 years old from families too poor to demand justice. Von Zimmern and his associates would identify vulnerable girls, often orphans or daughters of widowed mothers, then arrange employment opportunities that were actually kidnapping schemes. The girls would be told they were going to work as servants in distant cities, but instead were transported to remote tower prisons throughout the region. Barbara's testimony, given months after her rescue when she had regained enough psychological stability to speak coherently, revealed the systematic nature of her captivity. She described being told she was going to work as a seamstress in Vienna, but instead was taken to the tower where von Zimmern informed her she would remain until she agreed to become his mistress. When she refused, he began a systematic campaign to break her resistance through isolation, manipulation, and the constant threat that resistance would mean starvation. Court records preserve fragments of Barbara's account of her daily existence. She was kept in a single circular room, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with one small window too narrow for escape. Food was delivered through a rope system that was also used to remove waste, ensuring she had no direct human contact except when von Zimmern chose to visit. The isolation was designed to create complete dependency. She existed entirely at his discretion, with no control over when she ate, slept, or even spoke to another person. The extraordinary length of Barbara's hair wasn't accidental, it was evidence of systematic control. Von Zimmern had specifically forbidden her from cutting it, claiming that long hair made her more valuable. Court documents suggest this was both a control mechanism and a practical consideration, as extremely long hair made escape attempts more difficult and served as a visible symbol of how long she had been imprisoned. The hair had become both her chain and her calendar. Barbara's case led investigators to uncover at least 12 other similar operations across the region. Court records document the discovery of multiple towers and isolated buildings where young women had been held for years. Some victims were found alive but psychologically destroyed. Others had died in captivity from malnutrition, disease, or suicide. Still others had simply vanished without trace, their fates unknown even to their captors, who had moved them between locations or disposed of them when they became inconvenient. The investigation revealed that this wasn't random crime. It was an organized system that exploited the legal and social powerlessness of young women from poor families. The traffickers specifically targeted girls whose disappearance would not trigger serious investigation. Orphans, daughters of single mothers, and girls from families in debt were considered ideal victims because their families lacked the resources or social connections necessary to demand justice. Von Zimmer's network operated through seemingly legitimate business arrangements. He would approach struggling families offering employment for their daughters in distant cities where they could earn good wages and send money home. The families, desperate for income, would eagerly accept these opportunities. By the time they realized something was wrong, their daughters had disappeared into a system designed to make them untraceable. Despite overwhelming evidence, von Zimmer's trial demonstrates the limitations of medieval justice when dealing with wealthy criminals. His family's political connections and financial resources allowed him to avoid execution, receiving instead a sentence of exile and forfeiture of some properties. Most of his associates escaped punishment entirely by bribing officials or fleeing to other regions where they could establish new operations. The broader network continued operating for decades, adapting their methods based on what had been exposed in Barbara's case. Barbara's story spread through oral tradition across German-speaking regions, transforming over generations into the tale we recognize today. The tower became magical, the captor became a witch, and the rescue became romantic rather than traumatic. But the core elements remained. A young woman trapped in a tower, held against her will by someone who controlled every aspect of her life, with her long hair serving as evidence of her prolonged captivity. When the Brothers Grimm collected their version of Rapunzel in the early 1800s, they were recording a story that had circulated for over 200 years as a warning about the dangers young women faced. Their informants were often elderly women who had heard the tale from their grandmothers, the women who may have known the real Barbara Uthman or other victims of similar crimes. The fairy tale preserved the warning, even as it obscured the documented historical reality behind the magic. In the Brothers Grimm's original 1812 version of Rapunzel, the story begins not with a girl in a tower, but with a pregnant woman desperate for the green herbs growing in a witch's garden. This seemingly innocent detail reflects one of medieval Europe's darkest practices: the systematic trafficking of pregnant women and forced surrogacy arrangements that operated through networks of wise women and midwives who used their medical knowledge to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. Medieval Europe's legal and social systems created perfect conditions for pregnancy trafficking. Wealthy families struggling with infertility had access to vast resources, but no legitimate options for obtaining children. Poor families facing starvation often had more children than they could feed, but no legal protections against exploitation. Between these desperate groups operated networks of women who presented themselves as healers and midwives while actually running sophisticated criminal enterprises. Church records from across the Holy Roman Empire document a practice that modern investigators struggle to fully comprehend: the deliberate targeting and abduction of pregnant women from poor families. These women would be held in isolated locations until they gave birth, after which their babies would be sold to wealthy families unable to have children of their own. The mothers would either be killed to eliminate witnesses or held indefinitely to serve as forced surrogates for future pregnancies. The character we know as Dame Gothel, the witch who takes Rapunzel, was based on documented figures who operated throughout medieval Europe. In 1547, French authorities arrested a woman named Marguerite Lesage, who had operated a pregnancy trafficking network for over 15 years. Her compound included an extensive herb garden, several small buildings where pregnant women were held, and detailed records of births and sales that revealed the scope of her operation. Court testimony from Marguerite's trial revealed how these networks functioned. She specifically targeted couples desperate for children, promising to provide babies through divine intervention while actually managing a network of kidnapped pregnant women. Her clients believed they were participating in religious miracles, paying enormous sums for what they thought were blessed children, granted through prayer and holy intervention. The garden element of Rapunzel's origin story reflects real medieval practice. Women who ran pregnancy trafficking operations needed extensive knowledge of herbs for several purposes: inducing labor when convenient for buyers, preventing pregnancies when they wanted to control timing, treating complications during forced births, and creating dependencies through carefully controlled nutrition. The garden wasn't magical, it was a pharmacy for reproductive coercion. The stories focus on the pregnant mother's craving for rampion, a specific herb, reflects genuine medieval understanding of pregnancy complications. Women suffering from severe morning sickness or nutritional deficiencies would indeed crave specific foods or herbs that their bodies needed. Traffickers like Dame Gothel would use this knowledge to identify vulnerable pregnant women, offering relief from their suffering in exchange for what seemed like minor favors, but were actually steps toward complete control. Medieval court records reveal that pregnancy traffickers operated through seemingly legitimate contracts. A pregnant woman suffering from complications might agree to live with a healer during her pregnancy in exchange for medical care and proper nutrition. The contracts would include clauses that effectively signed away parental rights, often written in legal language that illiterate women couldn't understand. By the time they realized the trap, escape was impossible. Marguerite's detailed records, preserved in French court archives, reveal the economics of pregnancy trafficking. Healthy infants could be sold for amounts equivalent to several years' wages for a common laborer. Male children commanded higher prices than females. Twins or multiple births were especially valuable, often sold to different families to maximize profit. The records show that Marguerite maintained careful breeding schedules, timing pregnancies to meet anticipated demand from wealthy clients. The original story's premise, that Rapunzel is given to Dame Gothel as payment for the stolen herbs, directly reflects this documented practice. Court records show multiple cases where women surrendered their children to trafficking networks, believing they were making temporary arrangements for care, only to discover their children had been permanently sold or would never be returned. The payment system created a veneer of legitimacy while facilitating systematic child theft. Medieval physician accounts describe treating women rescued from these situations, documenting physical and psychological trauma consistent with prolonged captivity and repeated forced pregnancies. The medical records describe women who had been deliberately kept pregnant almost continuously, giving birth to child after child who were immediately taken away and sold. The physical toll was devastating, often resulting in permanent injury or death from complications related to excessive childbearing. The tower imprisonment of Rapunzel represents the second phase of pregnancy trafficking operations. Once babies were born and sold, the mothers were often kept alive as future breeding stock. The isolation served multiple purposes: preventing escape, maintaining psychological control, preventing the women from forming relationships that might interfere with forced pregnancies, and keeping them available for wealthy clients who had paid for exclusive access to specific women. Court documents reveal that some trafficking operations maintained multiple locations where women in different stages of pregnancy were held. Women who had just given birth would be immediately impregnated again, creating a continuous cycle of forced reproduction. The psychological trauma was deliberately cultivated. Broken women were easier to control and less likely to attempt escape or rebellion. The rescue fantasy that appears in later versions of Rapunzel reflects the desperate hope of families whose daughters had been taken. Court records show that families would spend their life savings trying to locate missing daughters, hiring investigators, and even attempting to negotiate with kidnappers. The fairy tale transformation of these desperate rescue attempts into romantic adventures reveals how communities coped with the reality that most stolen women were never recovered. Perhaps most disturbing, church records reveal that some religious authorities were aware of pregnancy trafficking operations, but failed to intervene because the traffickers were providing babies to wealthy Catholic families who made significant donations. The witch label, applied to figures like Dame Gothel, may have been a way to condemn the practice while avoiding direct criticism of the social and religious systems that enabled it. The documentation of pregnancy trafficking cases, like those that inspired Rapunzel, led to some of the earliest European laws, specifically protecting pregnant women and regulating midwifery practices. However, these laws were often poorly enforced, and similar operations continued well into the 18th century in remote rural areas where authorities had little oversight. The fairy tale preserved the warning about these practices even as the legal system failed to stop them. In the Brothers Grimm's original version of Rapunzel, when Dame Gothel discovers the prince's secret visits, she doesn't simply banish him. She cuts off Rapunzel's hair, uses it to trick him into climbing the tower one final time, then pushes him from the great height into a thicket of thorns that pierce his eyes, leaving him permanently blinded. This graphic violence wasn't added for dramatic effect. It was recording actual medieval justice practices and the real consequences faced by men who attempted to rescue trafficking victims. Medieval court records document multiple cases where men attempting to rescue women from trafficking operations faced severe retribution, often including deliberate mutilation designed to serve as warnings to others. The blinding of men who saw too much was a specific practice used by criminal networks to discourage rescue attempts and maintain the secrecy of their operations. The violence was calculated and systematic, designed to destroy would-be heroes while keeping them alive to spread terror. In 1563, German court records document the case of Johann von Eckhart, a minor nobleman who discovered that his sister had been held in a trafficking operation for 3 years. When he attempted to organize her rescue, he was captured by the criminal network, tortured for information about what he had discovered, and then had his eyes deliberately destroyed with heated metal implements. The court record notes that this was specifically intended to prevent him from identifying other victims or locations if he was released. The investigation that followed Johann's mutilation revealed why this particular form of violence was so commonly used by trafficking networks. Medieval criminal operations understood that killing would-be rescuers created martyrs and increased investigation pressure from authorities and communities. But permanently disabling them sent a powerful message while still allowing some hope of survival. Court records show that blinded men were often released specifically because they could serve as living warnings to others about the consequences of interfering with trafficking operations. The fairy tale's description of the prince falling into thorns that pierce his eyes reflects actual medieval punishment and defensive methods. Thorn pits were real fortification features used around criminal compounds, designed not just for defense, but for deliberately maiming intruders in ways that would discourage future attempts. The thorns weren't random vegetation, they were cultivated specifically for their ability to cause maximum injury while allowing victims to survive long enough to spread warnings about what happened to those who attempted rescue. Court documents reveal that trafficking operations developed sophisticated methods for protecting their locations and deterring rescue attempts. These included spreading false information about the locations being cursed or haunted, maintaining armed guards who were specifically trained in non-lethal but permanently disabling violence, and most importantly, ensuring that anyone who discovered the operations faced consequences so severe that survival meant permanent disability and lifelong trauma. Medieval physician accounts describe treating men who had suffered deliberate eye injuries during conflicts with criminal networks. These medical records provide detailed descriptions of the methods used to cause blindness, including heated implements, caustic substances derived from certain plants, and deliberate puncturing with pointed objects specifically designed to destroy vision while minimizing fatal bleeding. The consistency of these injuries across different regions suggests coordinated methods being shared between criminal operations. The reality of rescue attempts was far more brutal than fairy tales suggest. Medieval records show that families attempting to rescue trafficked daughters faced a calculated system of deterrence. Even successful rescues often resulted in severe injuries or death for the rescuers, and the women they saved were frequently so psychologically damaged that they couldn't provide testimony that would lead to prosecutions. The fairy tale's depiction of a blinded prince reflects the genuine trauma experienced by men who survived these encounters. The fairy tale's specific mention that the prince wanders blind for 7 years before reuniting with Rapunzel reflects documented patterns in medieval justice and recovery. Court records show that men who survived attacks by trafficking networks often spent years trying to navigate legal systems that were reluctant to prosecute wealthy or connected criminals. 7 years was often the minimum time required to gather enough evidence and political support to achieve any kind of justice, if justice was possible at all. Medieval court records reveal why the prince's blinding served as such an effective deterrent. The legal system rarely prosecuted violence against men attempting to rescue trafficked women, especially if the criminal networks had sufficient political connections. The deliberate maiming of would-be rescuers was tacitly accepted by authorities as a consequence of interfering with what they often treated as private business arrangements between consenting adults, despite overwhelming evidence of coercion and abuse. The magical element, where Rapunzel's tears restore the prince's sight, represents the only hope medieval communities had for justice. That victims who had survived trafficking operations might eventually recover enough to provide testimony that could bring down their captors. In documented cases, women who had been trafficked sometimes took years to psychologically recover enough to identify their captors or describe their experiences in ways that courts would accept as credible testimony. The fairy tale's happy ending, where the blind prince finds Rapunzel living in the wilderness with their twin children, reflects real outcomes from some trafficking cases. Court records show instances where rescued women, unable to return to their families due to shame and trauma, would establish new lives in remote locations far from the scenes of their abuse. The men who had attempted their rescue, often disabled from their efforts, would sometimes join these informal communities of survivors. The stories mention that Rapunzel has twin children when the prince finds her reflects documented outcomes from trafficking cases. Many women rescued from forced imprisonment were pregnant or had given birth during captivity. The twin detail specifically appears in multiple medieval accounts, suggesting it may reference actual cases where trafficked women bore multiple children whose paternity was deliberately obscured to prevent identification of their captors. The preservation of these violent details in oral tradition served as warning systems for medieval communities. The graphic description of the prince's blinding taught men that attempting heroic rescues could result in permanent disability, while the eventual reunion offered hope that justice might eventually be achieved through persistence and community support rather than individual action. The fairy tale became a survival guide that acknowledged both the real costs of resistance and the possibility of eventual recovery. Community response to trafficking operations was shaped by these documented consequences. The blinding of would-be rescuers created a climate of fear that allowed criminal networks to operate with impunity for years or even decades. Only when communities organized collectively, rather than relying on individual heroes, could they successfully challenge these operations and protect their vulnerable members from systematic exploitation. Rapunzel's impossibly long hair, the most iconic element of her story, wasn't originally a symbol of beauty or femininity. It was evidence of prolonged captivity and psychological control. Medieval records document that forced hair growth was a specific technique used by captors to maintain dominance over their victims, serving simultaneously as a practical restraint, a symbol of ownership, and a psychological weapon that reinforced helplessness and dependency. Court records from across medieval Europe describe criminal operations that specifically controlled victims' appearance as part of broader psychological manipulation. In trafficking cases, captors would forbid hair cutting, nail trimming, or other basic grooming practices that allowed victims to maintain personal autonomy. The resulting extreme hair growth served multiple purposes. It made escape more difficult, marked the victims as property, and created a visible timeline of their captivity that reminded them daily of how long they had been imprisoned. Medieval investigators documented how extremely long hair functioned as an effective restraint system. Hair that reached 6 feet or longer could be braided, weighted, or tied to fixed objects, limiting a captive's movement without requiring traditional shackles that might leave obvious evidence of imprisonment. Court testimony from rescued victims describes how their hair would be deliberately tangled with rope or weights, making escape attempts physically impossible and creating constant physical discomfort that reinforced their helpless condition. In 1598, authorities in Nuremberg discovered a trafficking operation where victims' hair length was meticulously recorded as documentation of their time in captivity and their current market value. The investigative records reveal a systematic catalogue where the longer the hair, the higher the price charged to wealthy clients who specifically sought women who had been properly prepared through extended isolation. This commodification of hair length reveals how captors transformed symbols of femininity into markets for exploitation. The medieval period's cultural emphasis on long hair as the ideal of feminine beauty provided perfect cover for trafficking operations. Women with extremely long hair appeared to embody cultural ideals rather than showing evidence of systematic abuse. Court records reveal that captors deliberately exploited these beauty standards, presenting their victims as examples of perfect femininity while hiding the violence and coercion required to maintain their appearance. The original Grimm version begins with Rapunzel's mother craving lettuce from Dame Gothel's garden, but earlier variants specify herbs known to promote hair growth. Medieval medical texts document that certain plant combinations could indeed accelerate hair growth, and trafficking operations used this knowledge strategically. Forced consumption of hair growth herbs served both to create the desired physical appearance and to demonstrate complete control over victims' bodies, even down to their biological processes. Medieval records reveal that long hair served as a primitive communication system in trafficking operations. The specific ways hair was braided, arranged, or displayed could indicate a victim's status, their captor's preferences, or even hidden messages to potential rescuers or clients. Court testimony describes women who learned to communicate information about their situations through subtle variations in how their hair was styled when they appeared at windows or during the brief moments they might be seen by outsiders. The fairy tale detail of Rapunzel appearing at her tower window with her hair hanging down reflects documented practices where trafficking victims were deliberately displayed to potential clients or buyers. Medieval court records describe tower viewing arrangements where wealthy men would pay substantial sums to see captive women, with hair length and arrangement serving as indicators of availability, price, and the specific services that might be purchased. Medieval physician accounts describe treating women rescued from trafficking operations who exhibited severe psychological trauma specifically related to their altered appearance. Victims described feeling that their extremely long hair had become part of their prison, making them feel monstrous or inhuman. The forced maintenance of beauty standards became a tool of psychological destruction rather than enhancement, turning feminine ideals into instruments of torture and control. Dame Gothel's decision to cut Rapunzel's hair when she discovers the prince's visits represents more than punishment, how it reflects documented practices where captors would remove victims' hair as the ultimate assertion of control. Court records describe how hair cutting was used as psychological torture, stripping away what victims had been forced to see as their only remaining connection to femininity and personal identity. The cutting served as both punishment and threat, demonstrating that even their physical appearance existed entirely at their captor's discretion. Medieval trade records document a thriving market for extremely long human hair, used for wigs, hairpieces, and various luxury items worn by wealthy women. Some trafficking operations specifically harvested hair from their victims for sale, creating an additional profit stream while psychologically devastating the women who were already being exploited. The economic value of long hair provided practical motivation for the extended captivity periods needed to grow it to marketable lengths. The fairy tale image of the prince climbing Rapunzel's hair reflects documented rescue attempts where long hair was used as an improvised rope system. Court records describe actual cases where men attempting to reach captive women used hair as climbing assistance, though these attempts rarely succeeded and often resulted in severe injuries to both the rescuer and the victim whose hair was being used. The physical reality was far more brutal than the romantic imagery suggests. Archaeological evidence supports the prevalence of hair-based control systems in medieval criminal operations. Excavations of known trafficking sites have uncovered specialized combs, braiding tools, and restraint systems specifically designed for managing extremely long hair. The sophistication of these implements suggests that hair control was a developed technique rather than an improvised method, indicating systematic knowledge sharing between criminal networks. The preservation of hair-focused details in the Rapunzel story reflects how medieval communities processed collective trauma around trafficking and abduction. The transformation of hair from evidence of abuse into a romantic symbol, reveals how cultures cope with documented atrocities by reimagining them as consensual or magical, rather than acknowledging the systematic violence they represent. The fairy tale allowed communities to preserve warnings about trafficking techniques while making the stories bearable for children. Contemporary trafficking investigators recognize similar control patterns in modern cases, where captors manipulate victims' appearance as part of broader psychological control systems. The hair control documented in medieval trafficking cases parallels modern grooming techniques used to maintain dominance over victims while making their situations appear consensual to outside observers. The psychological principles remain unchanged across centuries. When the Brothers Grimm collected the Rapunzel story, they were preserving oral traditions that had sanitized, documented trafficking practices into romantic narratives. Their version eliminated most references to the economic and psychological functions of forced hair growth, transforming evidence of systematic abuse into symbols of feminine beauty and romantic devotion. Yet, despite centuries of romantic reinterpretation, the core warning of the Rapunzel story remained intact. Young women who disappeared into isolated situations with powerful controllers faced systematic, psychological, and physical abuse designed to destroy their autonomy and identity.